You should try to pay attention to the path that's straight away. For dear Jesus up in heaven, he can guide your ball today. Since you practice every weekend, you are starting to improve. Now you've learned to throw the big ball, but your hook is in the groove. When you're heading for those 10 pins and you feel life's not been fair, raise your head and look to Jesus. He can help you bowl a spare. If you end up in the gutter, don't feel shame and don't feel sorrow. You can always up your average. You can bowl again tomorrow. All too soon the ball grows heavy and your hair is tinged with gray, and your trembling feet they falter. You may trip along the way. You can barely see the head pin. You could use some perfect games, but you look back on your scorecard, empty dreams and open frames. Since your life is going nowhere and you feel you're at the end, at wit's end, just remember God the Father. He will be your coach and friend. Leave all doubts and tears behind you. Say goodbye to earthly woes. As the veil is lifted and you learn the secrets of the pros. You'll be rolling strikes like thunder. You'll be smashing pins like rain, winning trophies made from rainbows on an everlasting plain. While you stand and look toward glory and you carefully aim your ball, so your life should be aimed also. Body, soul, your mind, your all. This is the last verse. In an alabaster alley, silver balls and golden pins, you are bowling with the master, and the master always wins. As those pearly gates swing open and you pass from earthly strife, you're presented with the trophy. You have won the game of life. I mean, it's kind of bizarre that these are songs that they actually sang back in the early 1800s. Oh, I thought you wanted to say something. You're waving to your son.
I shouldn't really.
All right, well, we ready? All right, Jamie says it's okay now to get started. So, well, first of all, I'm glad you all are here today. Let me tell you a little bit about the session minutes, and there is some stuff back there. If you want to look at it later, you're more than welcome to. There is a book of old session minutes. But we have 24 volumes of session minutes, and of course the early session minutes are all handwritten, and they're not that easy to read. But we have about 7,200 pages of session minutes, and I've read them all and made notes through the years. And I will quote some things out of the session minutes as we go through this presentation. So, let me get over here, and then this is backwards. I've got to go to there. That's the one I want. Oops, I went too far. The First Presbyterian Church was established in Indianapolis in 1823. And that was just a drawing of the First Presbyterian Church. Now, it was located on Governor's Circle, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. Well, 15 years later, there were some differences. There were two chains of thought in the congregation. There was the abolitionist movement. There was the women's rights movement. There were also some theological differences. And two of the big theological differences were these. The old school said, ever since Adam and Eve, man is born into sin, and it is through his thoughts and actions that he redeems himself and finds salvation. The new school of thought was, man is born pure and sinless, and it is through his thoughts and actions that he falls into sin and has to atone for the same. Well, the people that founded our church were of the new school of thought. And so, and of course, then 25 years later after this, this got involved, the Civil War came about. But anyway, in 1838, we pulled out, and our first church home was the Marion County Seminary, which was located on the northeast corner of Meridian and New York Streets, where University Park is today. Well, we needed a minister. So, in 1839, we issued a call to Reverend S. Holmes of New Bedford, Massachusetts, but he turned us down. And then we issued a call to Reverend John Young of Danville, Kentucky, but he turned us down. And so I said, we like to brag about Henry Ward Beecher was our first minister. Well, he was our third choice. He was not our first choice. But anyway, so we called Henry Ward Beecher to be our minister in 1840. Or 1839. And many of you may know the poem about Henry Ward Beecher. If you don't, I'll tell it to you. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher thought the chicken a most elegant creature. To thank him for that, it laid an egg in his hat and thus did the hen reward Beecher. So, Henry Ward Beecher came from what was known as the most famous family in America. His father, right here in the middle, Lyman Beecher, was president of Lane Seminary in Cincinnati. That was a big congregational seminary. And Lyman Beecher had 8 children by his first wife and 4 children by his second wife. This is his second wife here. The funny part is, all of the men in Beecher's family, these were all his brothers, here's another brother down here, were all Congregationalist ministers. Why a Presbyterian church called a Congregationalist minister is beyond me. But Henry Ward Beecher was not a Presbyterian. He was a Congregationalist minister. In fact, when he left this church, he went to the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims in New York City. Plymouth Congregational Church of the Pilgrims in New York City. But in any event, all of his family, they were known as the most famous family in America. He was a Congregationalist minister. He was a minister. Edward was the first president of Illinois College, and now Illinois University, and he organized Illinois' first anti-slavery group. Charles followed his brother, Charles was 2 years younger than Henry, to the city, and he was quite a musician, and he organized the first choir in the city. This brother, this is James, he was a missionary to China, and he was also commander of the 35th U.S. colored troops, because in those days the black people and the white people didn't intermingle in the military, and he was in charge of the U.S. colored troops. Isabella Hooker, she was a big women's rights activist. Catherine, she founded the women's first seminary in the United States. And of course, one of the famous ones was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which laid the groundwork for the Civil War. Also, it was the best-selling book of the 19th century, second best-selling book of the 19th century. And she was the most famous woman in the English-speaking world. The only book that outsold her book was the Bible. Anyway, so then we had to, after we got a minister, we needed a new church. So we built this church on the Governor's Circle. And we were there from 1840 to 1870. Now here's a plat of Governor's Circle, and it was called that because the governor's mansion was right in the middle of the circle. And James Ray was the governor when the governor's mansion was finished in 1827. And Mrs. Ray said, if you think I'm going to move in a house in the middle of Indianapolis where everyone can see my laundry hanging out on the line, you are crazy. So no governor ever occupied the governor's mansion. But there were 5 churches on the circle. There was First Presbyterian over here, Second Presbyterian over here, Christ Church, which of course is there, and cheat a little bit because there was a congregational, the R's stand for residence, O for office. Right behind this residence, there was a Congregationalist church. So I kind of said, well, it's really on the circle, but you know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. And then Wesley Chapel, that became Meridian Street Methodist Church, which now is down at 55th and Meridian Street. So we were there until 1870. Well, in 1845, we established the Ladies' Sewing Society. It supported the church by making and selling such domestic items as clothing, food, and simple home manufactures. That's what I got from the session minutes. And also, when I read you some of these things from the session minutes, you may say, well, that sounds kind of funny. That's the way it's written in the session minutes. It's not me telling you the wrong thing, and there is some funny wording in there. Anyway, so in 1848, Beecher left and he went to the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims in Brooklyn Heights, New York. And he became so famous there, you have to remember, this was even before radio and stuff, that people would flock to hear him preach. And the ferry that went across the East River became known as the Beecher Ferry. Well, in our first church, we had a pew plan, and you rented your pews. Here's a little blow-up. You see, Mrs. Wiseman, she paid $20 for her pew. Mr. Fishback, he paid $30 for his. And you can see all these in here, and they paid different amounts of money for their pews. And in fact, in the church that I grew up in, the second church building, there was a sign out in the entrance to the church that said free pews. So it was not unusual in those days for churches to charge for the pews. Now, Now, you all know that today the job of the session is to run the church. They have a lot of control over what happens in the church. But does anybody know what the session's main business was back in the late 1800s?
Money?
No. Yes, you know?
Assisting the sick?
No. Well, no. It was to admit members and discipline members for unchristian conduct. So, I want to read to you some items out of session minutes. These are actually in the session minutes now. The following facts were communicated to the session by the pastor of the church, to wit, that Elisha Branby and Caroline, now his wife, late Caroline Neuwirth, both members of this church, had, previously to their marriage, been guilty of fornication with each other as admitted by themselves. That they waive the notice required to appear before the session and direct that session shall take such order as this case may call for. Therefore, resolve unanimously that said Elisha Branby and his wife Caroline be suspended from the privileges of the church until they show sufficient evidence of hearty repentance for said sins. And hearty is spelled H-A-R-T-Y, not H-E-A-R-T-Y. Here's another one. On motion, it was resolved that Nelson Erninger and Carrie H. Boatwright, having been suspended from church privileges for unchristian conduct and ample time having lapsed from making acknowledgement to the church and for evidence of repentance, be, and they are, excommunicated from the church. And it is ordered that this proceeding be made public to the church by the pastor. One more. Session charged Miss Elsie DeWitt, a member of the church, with immoral conduct to the manifest injury of her own Christian standing and reputation and to the flagrant reproach of the Church of Christ as set forth in the following specifications. Namely, that on or about the 2nd day of April, she was seen to go, and after an interval of time, to come from a house situated on the west side of the canal between New York and Ohio streets in the city of Indianapolis, known as Sandy Nelson's place, which house is reputed to be a place kept for the accommodation of the licentious. Miss DeWitt was called before the session to answer questions regarding why she visited the Nelson house. But it doesn't say why she visited the Nelson house. Anyway, so then, in 1864, we called a minister by the name of Hanford Edson, and he was here from 1864 to 1873. And he probably did more for this church than any minister in history, and you'll see why in a second. First of all, these are some of the things he did. He founded the Indianapolis Public Library System. We had a lot of important members at the church, and we didn't have a library. And so in the Thanksgiving Day sermon, he said that what this city really needed was a library system, and he hoped some of the people in the congregation would join him in establishing a library. And if you go to the library, or if you read the history of the Indianapolis Public Library, it will say it was founded by Hanford Edson. He founded the Colored Children's Orphanage, which took in children of former slaves when their parents were killed or injured in their flight to the North. He organized the Women's Missionary Society, which has descended into Presbyterian women. Dr. Edson moved our church way out to the suburbs at Vermont and Pennsylvania Street. And Dr. Edson also persuaded the trustees to purchase a plot at Crown Hill Cemetery for the burial of the poor of the church. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and I'll show you a picture of it. Dr. Edson was great on colonizing other churches. And when I say colonizing a church, he would take 15 to 20 people out of this church and go over here and start another church. Now, the Third Presbyterian Church, which shot off of the First Presbyterian, is now Tabernacle Presbyterian Church, which I know you all have heard of. But then we colonized the Fourth Presbyterian Church, which is now Fairview Presbyterian Church. Then the Fifth Presbyterian Church became Westminster. Then the Sixth Presbyterian Church became Olivet. Then we did the Seventh Presbyterian Church, which later became Calvary and was located in Fletcher Place, and descended into Traub Presbyterian Church. Then the Eighth Presbyterian Church, that was absorbed by Tabernacle. The Ninth Presbyterian Church was originally called the Senate Avenue Presbyterian Church. Then it was called the St. Paul Colored Presbyterian Church because it had mostly black membership. And then it descended into Witherspoon Presbyterian Church. Then the 10th Presbyterian Church was the Memorial Chapel, which merged with Meridian Heights, which is now First Meridian Heights. And then, anyway, I won't go into the rest of those. So, anyway, he did quite a bit in colonizing churches around town. Also, in 1870, when we moved out to Vermont and Pennsylvania Street, the population of Indianapolis was 48,244. Dr. Edson and his wife organized the Female Industrial Society, which was, their purpose was visiting the sick and the poor and for evangelization generally. They also started the Women's Missionary Society, which of course is now Presbyterian Women, and the first annual Praise Luncheon was held, which is still held today. This was the church at Vermont and Pennsylvania Street. You can see tell the age of it by the horse and buggy over here. In 1871, Dr. Hansen got Eleanor Kirby to come to the church. And she organized the first graded Sunday school in the city. She was an employee here longer than any other person in history. She was an employee here for 54 years. She also taught at Tudor Hall. So you can, as I say, you can see her picture out there. Then, as I said, in 1872, he persuaded the session that they should buy a plot at Crown Hill Cemetery for the poor of the church. This is the monument that's on the Crown Hill Cemetery lot. And we had a Chinese Sabbath school established here in 1878. It was for Chinese people who were working on the Transcontinental Railroad coming from California. And we had this Chinese Sabbath school here, and many of the Chinese people didn't have any money, so when they died, we buried them in this plot. But I think I have the plat in the file. I think there were originally 9 buried there, but then they removed like 6 of them, and then we had 2 other there. Anyway, currently the plot is, I think, for 14 people. There are currently 5 people buried there, and the last one buried there was Grace Gillespie in 1945. So we need some more poor people in the church, so we can put about the Crown Hill Cemetery. But I'll show you and tell you about this monument in a minute. But let's go on here. Here are the sanctuary chairs, which of course they call them sanctuary chairs. They're not sanctuary anymore. But the chairs, which I know many of you have seen, but you may not know the story behind them. They were given to us by Mrs. Ovid Butler. Her name was Hattie Tarkington. She was Booth Tarkington's sister. And her first name, Hattie, was spelled H-A-U-T-E, like Terre Haute. And these chairs were in her dining room. She lived at 1035 North Pennsylvania Street. Can you imagine having those chairs in your dining room? Anyway, then this was a picture of the Vermont and Pennsylvania Street Church before it was remodeled, and the choir loft was in the back, and this was in the front. Then they took out the balcony in the back, moved the choir loft to the front, which I'll show you a picture of later. But this was taken, it says, in memoriam of, that's John George Emil Renner. And Dr. Renner was an infectious disease doctor. And with the outbreak of yellow fever, he went to Tennessee to help fight the yellow fever epidemic, and he caught the yellow fever, and he died. He was only 28 years old. And so then we erected this monument at Crown Hill Cemetery. J.G.E. Renner, M.D., born at Eichenrath, Hesse, Darmstadt, Germany, January 20th, 1850. Died at Memphis, Tennessee, September 16th, 1878, of yellow fever. A victim in the cause of humanity. Erected by his fellow members of the Second Presbyterian Church, Indianapolis, as a tribute to his Christian heroism. Now, you've also probably seen the pictures hanging in the hallway right outside the parlor. The first one you come to is Edwin Peck. He was probably the wealthiest member that we ever had at Second Presbyterian Church, and gave more money to the church than anyone else. He joined the church. He came to Indianapolis. He was an architect, and he designed and built the state capitol building. That's what brought him to Indianapolis. He was then going to return to the east, but he didn't go back. So he stayed here. He joined the church in 1839, and he died in 1876. But he had no children, and he left to the church the Peck Fund. And it doesn't say in the session minutes anywhere how much this PEC fund was worth. However, if you read the session minutes, at least every other month, there was $500 given from the PEC fund. There was $1,000 given from the PEC fund. There was $3,000 given from the PEC fund. Now remember, $3,000 then would be like $60,000 today. I mean, they gave a tremendous amount of money out of the PEC fund. Well, the PEC fund was disposed of 65 years after it was established in 1941. And what happened to the PEC fund? I have never been able to find out. Nobody knows. It just says in the session minutes the PEC fund was disposed of according to the last will and testament of Edwin Peck. Well, I can't imagine that he would say, well, I'm going to set up this PEC fund and you can have it for 65 years and then you have to get rid of it. I don't know what happened to it. But anyway, so that was Edwin Peck. Then in 1889, the church organized the King's Daughters, and that descended into what today is the Indianapolis Day Nursery Association. Many of you may have heard of. In fact, we have a member of the Day Nursery Association right back there. She can tell you all about it if you want to know what it is. Then in 1890, Dr. Milburn came to the church. And it was said he was a great factor in the religious, social, civic, and intellectual life of the city. Generous to a fault and keenly interested in the underprivileged, he deserves a great deal of credit for Meyer Chapel. And I know many of you have heard of Meyer Chapel. That was like, this is Ferdinand Meyer. He was the one that financed Meyer Chapel. And Meyer Chapel was also almost like a secondary church or a satellite church. And it was down on the southwest side. Here's a picture of Meyer Chapel. This was the original this was the original chapel. Then they built the neighborhood house. Then they tore this chapel down and built another building there, a brick building, to match the neighborhood house. And it was at the corner of West and Norwood Streets. And it was built for young people in the area of the stockyards and the Belt Line Railroad. And if you can't figure out where it is, here's Lucas Oil Stadium, and right here is Meyer Chapel. And then we closed it in 1966 and sold it to the Indiana Department of Corrections. And they had it until about 4 or 5 months ago. There was an ad in the paper with a picture of it, and I picked up on it. And I knew it had been abandoned from probably 4 or 5 years. And it was up for auction. So it was auctioned off, and I don't know what happened to it. But that's where Meyer Chapel was. Then we remodeled the place at Vermont and Pennsylvania streets. And this was a picture of right after it was modeled, and here was what a little later decorated for Christmas. And to kind of give you an idea of what was there, we didn't have, many of you, this is kind of jumping ahead, but I'll go ahead and tell you. We didn't have a choir in those days. We only had a paid quartet. In fact, we didn't have a choir till we came out here. We had a paid quartet because there wasn't really room for a choir up there. So we had 2 soloists over here, 2 soloists over there. The organ was right behind the pew chairs here, and then the choir, the quartet, when they were getting ready to sing, they would come up here and stand and sing the songs. Well, and as I say, this is jumping ahead, but the only time we had a choir was at Christmas and Easter to sing the Hallelujah chorus. Well, my mother had a good friend, Mildred Baker, who loved to sing. But of course, she only got to sing twice a year. So one Christmas, Ed Biltcliffe, he was our organist at that point, he said to Mildred, he said, well, we're going to do a little concert after church on this Sunday. And would you sing, would you like to do the solo, I Know That My Redeemer Liveth? Well, she was thrilled that she was going to get to sing this solo. So she went home and she practiced. She was a good friend of my mother. She told my mother everything. So she went home and practiced and practiced and practiced. Well, that Thursday evening, it was for the choir rehearsal. It was a miserable night out, snowing, and it was just awful. And Mildred couldn't decide whether she should go to the choir rehearsal or not, but she finally decided, yes, she'd go ahead and go. So she gets in the car, and they lived out on the far west side at that point. But, you know, people think of everybody's second presence north. Well, they are now, but when we were downtown, people came from all over, because I grew up on the south side. Well, anyway, so she's coming into town. Well, she's driving along, and this raccoon runs right in front of her car, and she hit it. Well, she knew she had hit this raccoon, and she didn't know what she should do. Should she stop and see how the raccoon was, or should she go on to church? Well, she decided, no, she better come on to church. So she came on to church. Well, half of or about 3/4 of the people that were supposed to be coming to sing in the choir didn't show up. They had no tenors. So Ed Biltcliffe said, we're not going to be able to do this little concert after church on Sunday. I'm sorry, but, we won't be able to do it. Well, Mildred was convinced the Lord was punishing her for hitting that raccoon. So that evening, she called my mother. And she didn't know what to do. She said, well, what do raccoons eat? Well, how I got involved is I had a cousin who raised raccoons. And so my mother's asked me, what does Dwayne's raccoons eat? And I said, well, he gives them cherries and oranges, and they like Butterfinger candy bars crushed up and stuff. So the next day on Friday, Mildred went out. She got this stuff. She went back to where she had hit the raccoon. Of course, the raccoon wasn't there, but she put this food down, and she was just, thought if the raccoon was even alive, it could come back and, have some of this food to eat. Well, so Saturday morning, she drove back, and the food was gone. Well, she was convinced the raccoon was alive and it had eaten something. Well, Saturday afternoon, Ed Biltcliffe called her and said, Helen Crandall, who was our soprano soloist, has a terrible cold. She won't be able to sing her solo tomorrow at church. And I know you were practicing. I know that my Redeemer liveth. Would you be willing to sing that for the church service? Well, this was the Lord's reward for going back and feeding that raccoon. She was convinced. Well, several people said when she sang her solo, one woman said she had never heard anyone hit such a high C. And another woman said, I think I heard her singing, I know that my raccoon liveth. But anyway, so didn't mean to take you off track here, but I just thought that was kind of a funny story. Then, in 1898, Dr. Charles Hanson came to the church as organist. Dr. Hanson was born blind, and he was got his education at the Indiana School for the Blind. His wife also was an organist. But he was at our church. He was the longest staff person at the church. He was here for 47 years. You probably remember, Nancy back there probably remembers, or Bob Meeker remembers Dr. Hanson. I don't. I was only 3 years old when he died. But you probably remember him. But the thing about Dr. Hanson, he had quite a repertoire. And some people told me later that he liked to improvise between verses of the hymn. And sometimes he would get a little carried away, and it'd be like an organ concert that people would listen to. He also, if you said, Dr. Hanson, let's sing hymn number 329, he'd say, fine. He had every hymn, all 500 hymns in the hymn book memorized. All you had to do was tell him the number, and he could play it. Then in 1901, we had a lady here at the church by the name of Lucy Mayo. She was a missionary to Japan for 6 years, and the Nippon Mission Circle was established to help support her work in Japan. In 1902, we discontinued the rental of the pews, and that's when the sign went up, free pews. Then, in 1905, the Tiffany Studios of New York City redecorated the church, and this was the original drawing for the Tiffany window. The Tiffany window didn't do too well when we moved out here. Number one, in the old church, it was on the south side of the church. I don't know what the powers that be were thinking when we moved out here. Now it's on the north side. The north side of a building, the sun never sees. You get sun on the east, the west, the south all day long, but it never sees the north side. This thing was magnificent when it was in the old church. It doesn't not show up nearly as well today. Also, when we moved out here, if you look at the window carefully, up here and over here, there's two panels of just two plain blue glass. Those got broken in the move, and they never repaired them properly. In fact, we had a stained glass man here one time, and somebody tracked me down and wanted me to show him around and stuff, and so I showed him the Tiffany window, and he said, it needs work. I said, I know it needs work, and I've been on a kick about that for probably 20 years. And he said, what you have here is you have a Rembrandt painting that got ripped, and you put it back together with masking tape. He said, that is not good. I said, I know that. But the other thing about this window, there were two other panels, and they got sold at the church auction. They didn't make it out here with the church. So anyway, that's the Tiffany window. And also, this is the book, the indispensable book on Louis Tiffany's Masterworks by Alistair Duncan. And this was kind of interesting to me. There are only 4 Tiffany windows in Indianapolis. There's ours, it's the only one still in a building, in a church. There is the Harrison Memorial window, which was in the First Presbyterian Church, and it's now at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And if you go out to Crown Hill Cemetery, there are 2 Tiffany windows in private mausoleums out there. If you go over by the Gothic Chapel, right across the road that runs across the north side of the Gothic Chapel, there's the Dixon Mausoleum and the Knight Mausoleum. And I did a little research, and Mrs. Dixon and Mrs. Knight were sisters. And they built mausoleums next to each other, and there's a Tiffany window in each one of those mausoleums. So, then in 1912, we organized Boy Scout Troop 18. That troop is still going, and it's the oldest Boy Scout troop in the city today. We had the first 3 Eagle Scouts in the city also. In 1921, Dr. Gene Milner came to our church, and he was the one a lot of you grew up with, and he was our longest serving minister. He was here for 39 years. He also took a Darwin's theory of evolution came about. And that kind of almost divided the Presbyterian Church, because the General Assembly tried to address that. But William Jennings Bryan, who many of you may know, he controlled the Democratic Party. He ran for president 3 times, and he was Secretary of State. But he was in the General Assembly. And he took he was a very strong stand against Darwinism and evolution, and he most famously in the Scopes trial of 1925. But Dr. Milner, on the other hand, he took a forceful stand on Darwin's theory of evolution. And so, as I say, it almost caused a split within the church, but somehow we survived. In 1923, we established our endowment fund here at the church. In 1927, the state of Indiana built the War Memorial here. This is First Baptist Church, which is now up at 82nd and College, and here's our church. For years, from the early 1900s, I'd say about 1915, well, let me show you another picture. Originally, the War Memorial was going to be built here, where Obelisk Square is. But then the powers that be decided, well, it should be a place of great reverence. And how much more reverent could it be than between 2 churches? So they threw it a block south, and they built it between the 2 churches. Well, from about 1915, 1916, in session minutes, we went back and forth with the state of Indiana about buying the churches and, tearing them down and finishing them and all of that stuff. And that went on and on and on for years. And in the 1950s, Frank Lloyd Wright came to Indianapolis, and the City Fathers decided to give him a tour of the city, and so they drove him past the War Memorial, and they said, "You see this War Memorial? Eventually we're going to tear down those 2 churches and complete the War Memorial Plaza. Don't you think that'll be nice?" And Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Well, if you want my opinion, you would tear down the War Memorial and leave the 2 churches." But that didn't work, and so eventually in 1950, eventually I'll get back to that later, but anyway. In 1928, in the session minutes, it discussed the number of hymns to be sung in a service and whether it is acceptable to omit stanzas of hymns. That had to get session approval. Also in 1928, Louis Lathrop and A. Kiefermeyer gave $6,000 to Meyer Chapel to build a medical clinic. Then in 1929, a lady was a member of this church by the name of Mary Hanson Carey. She was a very wealthy lady, and she was pretty much of a recluse. And Dr. Milner, in fact, our organ there's a plaque on the organ that Mary Hanson Carey gave money for that. Dr. Milner got her to kind of come out of the closet and be accepted and get involved in things and do something with her money. She had no children, and do something with her money other than just hoard it. And so she gave away tremendous amounts of money, a lot of money to the church. And if you drive down Capitol Avenue and you get in front of Methodist Hospital and you look right across the street, it will say up there on the main building, the Julius A. Hanson Unit. She provided the funding. She gave but today it'd be about $13 million to build the hospital wing.
Fred?
Yes.
She also had the only electric car that came to church back.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, there you go. See? He remembers that. And speaking of that, now we're up to 1933. That man right there was confirmed in the Second Presbyterian Church in 1933. He was confirmed 80 years ago.
That's awesome.
He was a member of this church before anybody else that's alive today. Just thought I'd point that out. Also in the session minutes in 1933, the session decided that the doxology could be used to open the service, but no singing during the offertory. In 1942, we established the Servicemen Center, which was to serve men on leave from Fort Benjamin Harrison. In 1948, the Presbyterian Women's Bazaar began, and of course you all know what that is. Still going in today. Now, in 1956, the General Assembly passed what was called Overture F. And in the old days of Second Presbyterian Church, if you were a deacon or an elder, you served for life. I mean, you were just there forever. And Overture F was passed by the General Assembly, and it said that terms had to be limited to 3 years. So this was going to be a big change for our church. Oh, let me go back just a second, though. Let me tell you something else that happened in the 50s. My dad was ushering one Sunday. This is kind of bizarre. And this is kind of a funny story, another funny story. And this black couple came to the church. And of course, we'd never had black people at the church. So they were sitting about halfway down, and they started the service. And in those days, the offertory came rather early in the service. The sermon came later. And so they were sitting down there. And this black lady, this Dr. Milner, would say something. She'd say, "Hallelujah, brother." And then a little later, she'd say, "Praise Jesus." And so the ushers decided, well, what are you going to do with that lady that's hollering down there? So the one deacon said, well, when I go down and take the offertory, I'll say something to her. So he went down and he said, "Lady, we don't holler in our church." And she said, "But I got religion." He said, "But this is not the place for it." Well, he realized when he got back and told the other ushers or deacons what he had said, that he should not have said that. And so that's how I knew about what he said. But anyway, so this, oh, yes.
When you said the legislature changed, instead of for life, deacon and...
No, not the legislature. That was the General Assembly.
The General Assembly.
Overture F.
Presbyterian.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
General.
I was worried the State House was trying to...
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I may have used the wrong. I may have said legislature. No, I meant the General Assembly. No, they changed that. And I don't think anybody knew about that. And I don't know why it seemed to be such a deep, dark secret, but I'll get into that a little later. But, because like Charlie Lynn, he served as like an elder for over 40 years. I mean, a lot of the people, well, Nancy Lowe back there, her father was an elder for what, 15, 20 years probably. I mean, no, that was just, and then if there was a vacancy on the deacon's board, Dr. Milner would handpick someone to become the deacon. And then if there was a vacancy on the elders board, he would handpick someone from the deacon's board to move over to the elders board. So it was kind of bizarre in those days. Now, this was one of our first church directories in 1957. And you see up here, these were normal couples. My parents made it here. They got into normal couples. Mr. Meeker's parents over here, they made it into normal couples. Then we had bachelors, and I want you to notice how bachelors is spelled. B-A-T-C-H.
Circle, bachelor's.
Oh, right there. Here, I'm probably your way. You need to move over. Then we had maids. And we had widows and widowers and youths under 25. So there we are. There's Nancy's brother, Bob Lowe. He made the list. I just thought that was kind of funny the way they labeled them normal couples and all that stuff. Well, oh, and then we had the aged and homebound. I forgot about them. So then, Charlie Lynn, okay, see there, he was an elder from 1915 to 1958. So for 43 years, he was an elder. He was the one that spurred us to move out here to North Meridian Street. Charlie Lynn was quite wealthy, he got in kind of on the ground floor of Eli Lilly and Company. He was the head of the sales for Eli Lilly and Company. He had no children. He was married first, and that wife died, and then he married his secretary, Dorothy Black. But anyway, he's the one that bought all of this ground out here, the original 22 acres, but he didn't want anyone to know he was buying it. So he worked through a realtor that was a member of the church by the name of Noble Hilgenberg, and he amassed all this ground. Well then, as I said, for years and years, we had talked about leaving downtown and moving out here, and leaving downtown and moving out here. Well, it just so happened in the mid-50s that Harold Hanley was governor of the state of Indiana, and Charlie Lynn had been his campaign manager. Well, Nell Downey, who was a member of this church, and her granddaughter, Becky Haggerty, many of you know, Nell Downey was one of the first representatives, or first women in the House of Representatives. And Wendell Martin, Bob Meeker's brother-in-law, was in the state Senate. So Charlie Lynn got Nell Downey and Wendell Martin together and said, if ever we're going to get the state to buy our properties, this is the time. So Nell introduced it through the House, which is where all spending bills start. Then Wendell got it through the Senate. And then, of course, Harold Hanley, since he owed so much to Charlie Lynn, he couldn't very well say, I'm not going to sign it into law. So he signed it, and that's how we ended up coming out here. But what you may not be aware of, this was the first church building that we were going to build out here. This was going to be the new Presbyterian Church in Meridian Hills. But actually, it was going to be a satellite church originally, but then they decided to move the whole church out here. But that was the building that was originally planned for here. This is a picture of the last service at the old church. And here's a picture of the auction brochure where we're going to auction off this Tiffany stained glass windows. Incidentally, my mother bought one of those windows. There were two, they call them a window. There were two 21-foot sections and a rosette at the top, and she paid, I think, $50 for it. And also, those pictures outside the parlor, Mother wanted 2 or 3 of those picture frames, but they sold them as a lot. I think there were 7 or 8 in the lot. She paid $75 for them and took them home. And I remember one was an aerial view of Hanover College, because I went to Hanover. And Mother said, when we were moving from our house out to another house, Mother said, what are we going to do with those paintings in the attic? And I said, well, let's give them back to the church, see if they want them. So that's those paintings hanging outside of the parlor up there. God, if I'd have known then what I know now, probably wouldn't have given them back to the church. But that would have been a good $75 investment. But the only things we brought out here to this church were the organ and the ascension window. And of course, in those days, the organ was up front. Now, let me ask you this, some of you that have been around for a while. When we moved out here, where was our church library?
Oh, it's in the room 312.
312, that is correct. Mm-hmm. That is correct. And where was our choir room?
PW.
That is right, which is now the PW room. Yeah. Right. Also, in 1960, the session voted to name the chapel the Lynn Chapel in memory of Charlie Lynn. Well, they ordered a plaque to go in there, and it seems like the plaque evidently got lost, and many years went on, and then they named it the Milner Chapel, and then they found the plaque, and so they put it back in the narthex. That's that plaque back there about Charlie Lynn. Also in 1960, that was our first spire was published, and right back there is the, stand up my dear. She was the editor of the first spire. Nancy Criplin, in case many of you don't know her, but I'm sure you do. Well, in 1960, Dr. Paul Hudson came to the church. And if ever there was a downtime in the church, it was under Dr. Hudson, although not all his fault. I was at Hanover College with his son, Paul Jr. But Dr. Hudson came, and I'm kind of convinced that Dr. Milner had been here 39 years. I don't know, maybe even if Jesus Christ himself came, he would have been run out of the church. I'm not sure about that. But Dr. Hudson then wanted to pull things in line with, as I said, we didn't do a doxology, we had things, they went in line. Well, we did do a doxology, but the ministers walked into the doxology in those days. We didn't use it during the offertory. And these elders and stuff, went on forever. Well, Dr. Hudson then decided that he was going to pull this into the Presbyterian line of the liturgy, and the people, elders and deacons could only serve a 3-year term. Well, you could actually serve 2, but you had to be like anyway. Pull it into that. Well, a lot of people got upset, and I don't know why nobody ever mentioned this Overture F, which had been instigated. Because my father didn't. My father was very much against Hudson. He didn't seem to know anything about it, and I was down at, and I'd hear 2 different stories. I'd hear my father's story up here, and then at Hanover, I'd hear Paul Jr.'s story, and they were conflicting. I wasn't sure who was right, but nobody ever mentioned this Overture F thing. So anyway, finally they decided they were going to get rid of Dr. Hudson. And we had a congregational meeting, and why I was at that meeting, I don't know. But I was there, and they had to bring someone in from, to be the moderator of the meeting, and they brought this little minister from the southern part of the state, and he didn't have a very loud voice or anything, and he lost complete control of the meeting. I mean, people were standing up saying, "Get rid of him! We don't want him here!" No, it was not. Were you there at that meeting? Were you there, Bob? Okay, no, it was not a pleasant meeting. But anyway, we ousted Dr. Hudson, unfortunately. And as I say, I think if he had taken a little more time, a little more slowly, and made the changes more gradually, it wouldn't have been quite, but it split families. There was one couple here in the church, one brother and sister here in the church, that the sister was very much for Hudson and the brother was very much against, and the brother and his wife and family left the church, and the brother and sister didn't speak for like 5 years. It was not a pleasant experience. So, also at that time, because of this scandal, so to speak, we made Time magazine. Here's the cover, November of 1961, and here's the article, Prickly Preacher, and here's Dr. Hudson in front of the church. So, anyway. Also, the session decided we would do the doxology at that time. We would do the doxology, but there would be no Apostles' Creed in the service. Then Dr. Harold Martin came to the church, and he was the one that kind of held the church together. It was due to his work that he, healed the wounds, and the church didn't split, because that was very possible that, it could have split. In the session minutes of 1963, the session voted the Apostles' Creed be used as part of the communion service and on other special occasions deemed appropriate by the senior minister. Session also voted approval in principle of the placement of a cross in the front of the sanctuary. So if we wanted to put a cross in the sanctuary, we had to get session approval. They also, in 1964, the session minutes said, no plaques will be permitted in the church. Well, that went by the wayside. Then in 1967, we added the education wing, and we remodeled the chancel. Here's a picture of the chancel before it was remodeled. See, most people don't realize this. The organ was right back here. This was the choir loft. Where those indentations are on each side of the chancel, that's where the pipes were for the organ. And this was the balcony where the organ is now. Now, I ask you this. When we moved out here, when we added the education wing, where was the youth lounge?
2:30, women's room.
That is correct. That is correct. It went from the choir room, because the choir now got their own room, so the youth lounge was over there. To hell with the Presbyterian women. We still didn't have a place for them. That's beside the point. Then there was a gal who was in Sunday school with me by the name of Susan Duck, and she was the first woman ordained at Second Presbyterian Church, and also the first woman ordained in the presbytery. In 1967, we also had our first women elders. In the session minutes of 1968, it says that the first Negro was hired on staff other than a janitor. In 1969, we had the first women's deacons. And I was a deacon in the mid-60s, and I remember every year it would come up in the deacons meeting, should we have women deacons? No, we talk about things that they shouldn't hear, and no, we don't want, walking down the aisle with those high heels clicking as they go. No, 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 we don't want women deacons. Well, finally we got some in 1969. Also, interracial marriage was approved in 1969. In 1974, we put in the new organ in the chapel, and it was called the Hanson Memorial Organ, although I don't think anybody remembers that, but that was named after our organist for so many years. Then Dorothy Neville, she was the first woman minister. Susan Duck was the first one ordained here, but she was the first woman minister on the staff at Second Church. And unfortunately, after she became a minister, she only lived for like 3 or 4 years, and she didn't live very long. But also in the session minutes in 1977, it says, there will be no formal dress code for elders serving communion or for ushers. I think the ministers have kind of overruled that, but that's what it says in the session minutes. Then, Dick Armstrong was our minister in 1977, and Margaret Herder, many of you know Margaret Herder. Dick called Margaret Herder and I into his office one day, asked us to come, and said, there's a company by the name of Nestle, they're coming out with a new product, Soup Time, and they want to do a hidden camera commercial here at the church. Would you two be willing to be in charge of this hidden camera commercial? And we said, yeah, that'd probably be kind of fun. Now this is top secret, you can't tell anyone. Okay, we said we would do that. So Margaret and I put our heads together and we decided we would have we had a group called Koinonia, a social group in those days. They want us to have 2 dinners. So we would have a dinner on a Saturday evening for the Koinonia group, and then we would have a dinner on Sunday after church for the choir. So, and they set up these 3 cameras around, and they had these hidden cameras, and this man went around, and and this woman, and they said they were writing a cookbook on church cooking and stuff, and we'd, like to know how was the soup and stuff. Well, so this was another funny story in that. So we had our thing on Saturday evening. Well, the people that were in charge called us in, and they said, when they were filming this thing, they said Alma Worthington was our cook at the time, or and head of the kitchen. And so they said, now we're going to put the 3 of you in this commercial. And I was taking boxes out of a big box, and Margaret was pouring water into the soup, and Alma was doing some cooking. And they said, you'll be in the commercials on television and stuff, and you'll be paid because every time it's run on television, you'll get a residual. I thought, yeah, right. Well, it ended up that, yes, we did, and I collected about $8,500 from just this was back in the 70s. But the sad part was, so after that Saturday evening thing, they called, oh, sorry about that. God, hit the wrong button here. Oh, I went way too far. Oh, there it is. There's the one I want. So this was, then it was in, this was either Newsweek or Time magazine. Here's Verlin Wilson, here's Connie Martin, here's Carol Steffel down here. They all got in there. But what I want to tell you, the sad part of that commercial was, so after that dinner on Saturday evening, these 2 men from Nestle Soup Time said, there were no black people at this meal. And I said, no, we don't have any black members. And they said, well, we can't use Alma in this commercial because that would be stereotyping unless there are black people that can be interviewed. And they said, could you call some black people and get them to come to the luncheon the next day? Well, who are we supposed to call and have them come to a choir luncheon? That wasn't part of the choir. So Alma got cut out of the commercial, and Alma's the one really that needed the money. And I mean, she could probably have used $8,500, but and I said, that's discrimination going the wrong way, in my opinion. But in any event. So, there was the Nestle Soup Time. Then in 1978, in the session minutes, they addressed homosexuality in the church. They didn't go into detail, but that's just what it says in the session minutes. In 1982, we helped Westminster Church, which we started our relationship with Westminster, which we founded in 1864. In 1987, the Center for Family Life Ministries was added. Then in 1988, on our 150th anniversary, I know I'm still too far. 1988, on our 150th anniversary, we added the east and west wings of the building. Now, when we added the east and west wings of the building, where was the youth lounge? Anybody know? It was down there in what is now the unfinished room. It was a nice room. It had a stage and all kinds of stuff. And then after the youth lounge, they got their own with the last thing. Then they tore out all the walls and stuff, and now it's just part of the unfinished room. Also, in that year, we buried a time capsule on the east side of the church. And it got lost, but I finally found it. Anyway, that's another story. In 1990, we had Ryan White's funeral here at the church. And in attendance were Michael Jackson, Elton John, and Barbara Bush. So that was probably one of our biggest, most famous things that happened at the church. In 1993, in the session minutes, it says they addressed alternative lifestyles for ordained ministers, whatever that means. In 1994, we started our relationship with David and Emily Matthews, who became medical missionaries to Cameroon, Africa. And here's the Matthews, and some of you probably know them, and their 3 kids, and we supported them for 5 years. Then also in 94, we started the celebration of hope with Light of the World Christian Church, and our first service was out at Clues Hall. And then it grew and it grew, and then we got more churches involved, and we ended up with 20 churches involved, and we had a service at Market Square Arena. But I think at that point it just got too big and unwieldy, and we had a lunch afterwards and stuff, and that was kind of the end of it, and then it fell apart. In 1995, the Great Banquet was approved, and that's when we started that. In 1996, we started broadcasting a 1.5-hour service on Sunday morning radio. We expanded the Celebration of Hope to, and that's when we expanded the Celebration of Hope to include 20 additional churches. Also at that time, we built the columbarium on the east side of the building. In 1997, Tom and Marjorie Lake's family gave about $4 million to establish the Lake Fellowship Parish Ministry, the Lake Fellows. That's what supports them. In 1998, 2nd at 6 service was started. Also in the session minutes of 1998, it says the church bazaars over the last 50 years have made $743,656. In 2007, we added our last addition to the building, and of course Dick McFarland, I know some of you know this, he gave $3 million towards this. Here's another picture of it. I went too far. Another picture of it. And then in 2010, we started this, we get involved in this internet hospitality network to provide food and shelter for homeless families. And that's starting this evening and runs through next weekend. So there we are, we're brought up to date. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Fred, many of us didn't get a chance to look at those historical things.
Yeah, not hysterical, historical.
Some of them were hysterical.
Well, that's true. You can go back and look at them.
No, I've got in any event, can we put those in the library or put them somewhere?
No. Things disappear.
Oh.
Nope. If they were in something that could be locked, a glass case or something, probably, but no. In fact, we have a volume of session minutes during the Civil War period which are missing. And I have to think somebody was doing some research on the Civil War and took that volume of session minutes, and it never got back to the church. So well, I understand that, but no, there's some archival stuff that we just do not let out. But I do want to point out one thing to you. Zachary, stand up. I want to point out to you this little guy right here, Zachary Thrasher. He is a 6th generation in Second Presbyterian Church. His mother was 5th generation, and if he joins the church, he'll be 6th generation. Yeah, Ernestine Rose.
That's the hookup.
Yeah.
His mother's was connected to Ernestine, et cetera, et cetera, et
And
cetera.
Judge Claypool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Claypool.
Hi, Mr. Fred. I get here a little late, but I have a question. In 1840, the circle was 5 churches.
Right.
Yes. Can you tell me those 5 and how you guys split from First Presbyterian
Right.
Church? Can you tell me a little bit of that?
Well, I already did that. See me afterwards and I'll tell you. Yeah, I don't want to repeat that. Okay? Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
How do we resolve the issue with the fact that Adolf and Scherer are on the prints for the state capitol that I renovated in 1988?
That was the previous state capitol, I think.
Meaning the guy that you mentioned.
Peck.
Yeah.
I think he did the current one.
Or
Huh? I'll talk to you about that later. Okay, let's sing our one song here and then we'll get out of here. But it's a long song, so we're not going to do all that. We'll sing verses 1 and then the chorus, verse 2 and 3 in the chorus, verse 4 and 5 in the chorus. And I'll play it through for you once. let's do verse 1. Verse 2. Now let's do verse 3. Chorus. Okay, we'll do verse 4 and 5 and then the chorus, okay? Verse 5. Chorus. Okay. No, we talked about that.